Yellow. There we go. Welcome. Welcome to our discussion of this year's Southminster Reads book. I'll start by telling a little story while we wait for a few people to straggle in. Not directly related to this book, but I was at the West Star conference a few months ago to hear our friend John Dominic Crossan and also hear our friend, who's not been here, so you don't know her, the Reverend Liz Theo Harris, who has worked with William Barber in the Poverty Project. What do they call it? The Poverty Project? The Poor People's Project. That's what I'm trying to think of. And she spoke, and one of the stories she told was of not very long ago chatting with a woman who was a well-known, I'm not sure she named her name, a well-known national reporter who's reported on all kinds of things in American society and politics and government for years and years and years. And after some minutes of talking to this reporter, the reporter sort of slapped her head and said, "Are you trying to tell me that if we wanted to, we could totally eliminate poverty in the United States?" I said, "That's exactly what I'm trying to tell you." And she told the story because she was stunned that a person who was a national mainstream media reporter for all things American for decades, that was the first it had penetrated her brain that was a doable concept. And I think most of us as Americans are at that place where it's like, wow, that's possible? Wouldn't we have to just like tear everything down and redo it to do that? No, not really. Anyway, that's what today's book is about. And let's go ahead and move to, we've got about a 11-minute video of Matthew Desmon doing an interview, and it summarizes a lot of the points of the book. So let's do that to make sure we're all aware of what the subject is, and then we'll hear from some of you what you've learned from reading this book.
Matthew Desmon, welcome.
Oh, man, so good to be here.
Really happy to have you. Tell us, with as much simplicity as possible, why are there so many who own so little and are paid so poorly in a country that has so much?
Because many of us benefit from that situation. You know, I read the novelist Tommy Orange's first book, There, and he has a line there that says, you know, kids are jumping out of the windows of burning buildings, falling to their deaths, and we think the problem is they're jumping. You know, and when I read that, I was like, man, that sounds like the poverty debate. You know, we constantly focus on the poor. We should be focusing on the fire, you know, who lit it, who's warming their hands by it. And I think that's a sentence that cuts through the complexity arguments. You know, some lives are made small so that others may grow, and that's just the plain truth of it.
Matthew, you have a couple of quotes from Tolstoy in the book that are so lovely. My favorite one is this: "I sit on a man's back, choking him and making him carry me, and yet assure myself and others that I'm very sorry for him and I wish to ease his lap by all possible means except by getting off his back." How do we create or exacerbate or perpetuate the poverty of other people in this country?
So a lot of times when you think about the welfare state, what the government does for us, we think about things like food stamps, public housing, makes sense. But a lot of us actually get a lot of help from the government. You know, if we take means-tested programs, these are programs for the poorest Americans, and we add those up with social insurance programs, these like what a lot of us get, Social Security, but also tax breaks. We got to count those too. And I know that's kind of weird, you know, sometimes, but, you know, both a tax break and a check from the government, they both contribute to the deficit, cost the government something, and they both put money in our pocket. And so when we do that, you learn that, you know, the average family in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, our poorest families, they get about $26,000 a year from the government. But our richest families, families in the top 20%, they get about $35,000 a year from the government. And so I think we do have to face the fact that a lot of us receive help from the government and don't really recognize it until the government puts those programs on the chopping block, and then we suddenly get up in arms. So this is like a way we contribute to poverty, because, you know, if we did a lot more to fight poverty as a nation, instead of guarding fortunes, and instead of, like, you know, giving most to families that don't need it, we can make a ton of difference. But a lot of us protect those benefits. You know, we like them.
I'm interested in the way that we tend to think about the working poor and the way we talk about the working poor. In the 1780s, Joseph Townsend, the writer, he said, "The poor lack pride, honor, and ambition." And then 200 years later, in the 1980s, the Smiths sang, although I think it was tongue-in-cheek, "The poor and the needy are selfish and greedy." Why has that image lasted for so long?
Yeah, I think that's like the propaganda of capitalism, in a way. You know, the early capitalists had a problem, right? How to take folks that were, you know, living on their land, getting by just fine, and move them into factories or into the coal mines or into mills. You know, that's a big problem. And the solution was hunger. You know, kind of enclose that land, take that away, make them have to work for their wages. And so when capitalism arose, you needed a big government. You know, you needed laws, you needed tariffs, you needed armies to protect, you know, property. But a big government could also hand out bread. And so this is where this kind of language starts, this idea of, like, you know, that bread's going to make people lazy, which means that bread's going to not allow folks to come work for me. And that kind of propaganda has been repeated over and over throughout the year. If we're going to end poverty in America, which is what I want to do, I want to end it. Some folks are going to have to take a little less from the government, you know? But I think what they get from that is they get a safer country. They get a more vibrant country. They get a freer country, right? They get a country where they don't have to worry that their kid might fall all the way down the ladder into real hardship. So I think that, you know, this is not going to come without sacrifice. But I think a lot of us, even those of us very secure in our money, are pining for this. Like, think of all, like, the engineers and scientists and computer whizzes that poverty has robbed from us and cost us. So I think unlocking that potential is a win for a lot of folks.
Let's talk about some of those people. Let's talk about some poor people. The book has real people, people whose stories are complicated, and whose money runs low. There's Crystal Mayberry. Yeah. There's your friend Wu. Yeah. There's your dad. Yeah. He was a pastor. I think he could read ancient Greek. And then he loses his job. And the bank, I think, took the home you grew up in. Yeah. How did losing something that your family owned, how did it shape you in the way you see the world?
I think it made me confused, you know, about why this is how the country dealt with a family when they fell on hard times. You know, my childhood home was $60,000. You know, and so I think that when that happened, when we lost our home, I blame my dad.
Have you ever talked to your dad about that? Have you ever talked to him about the anger you felt?
Yeah, I think so. You know, and I think that, to be honest, it's hard to get completely over that, even when you study it all day long. I think it's hard to really walk away from that. You know, talking about poverty in the abstract, you know, that's one thing, but talking about poverty when it comes to someone with a name and a face who's fully human, which means they make mistakes, you know, that's something that's more challenging. Yeah.
I was really moved by something in the book that's really selfish of me. You cite the work that my colleagues and I did on overdraft fees. Yeah. It's a way that some of the biggest banks in the world make just billions of dollars from some of the poorest people. Overdraft fees are now declining, although they're definitely not going away entirely. What are other concrete changes you'd like to see from companies, from big companies, in the finance industry or beyond to help abolish poverty?
I think we do have to end the unrelenting exploitation of the poor in the financial sector. You know, overdraft fees are declining, but that's only because savings went up during COVID, you know, because the enormous government relief packages. And as that money's drying up, I think we're going to see kind of an uptick again. Every year, about $11 billion in overdraft fees in a normal time. You know, most of that is charged just 9% of bank customers, the poor, made to pay for their poverty. We got to stop that. And we have to also ask ourselves, like you, me, and a lot of folks, you know, like, are we benefiting from this? Is my free checking account actually free, or is it, you know, subsidized?
But That's a concrete change, though. I think $11 billion, I think might have been a couple years ago. I'm going to have to check, but I want to say off the top of my head, I think it fell to 8 last year. Might have been the year before that. And I think it's going to keep falling. It's a rare example, I think. When I read your book, a lot of it can be disheartening. And I think of overdraft fees as like maybe a concrete reason to be optimistic, that like change actually does sometimes happen in profound ways.
Well, I would love for you to be right on that, truly, truly. We saw savings go up a lot during COVID. In COVID, we had 2 years where we were a different country. Like, most people were more financially secure during the pandemic than before it. And so I think that one of the trends you're seeing, I think, in the overdraft fees might be a response to that. Savings went up. Folks started businesses during the pandemic, actually. A lot of bad indicators went down. And probably the most powerful thing for us is, we cut child poverty in half. We cut child poverty in half in 6 months. And then we just let those programs go away.
Your book and exactly what you're talking about now, I mean, it did make me reconsider poverty as like kind of an existential threat that faces our country, But the climate disaster is getting worse. The whole kind of experiment of American democracy seems kind of iffy sometimes. And then to consider poverty as an existential threat to our country is scary. Besides overdraft fees, what reasons do you have to feel a sense of optimism, a sense of hope?
I think the American people are done with us. They're done with our old, tired myths about poverty. I think on the ground level, neighbor to neighbor, there's a lot of folks that want more equity, less poverty. The survey data show that like most Americans think the minimum wage is too low. Most Americans think the rich aren't paying their fair share of taxes. They're right. Most Democrats and most Republicans today think that poverty is a result of unfair circumstances, not a moral failing, not something that I did. That's a sea change. So there's something happening in the American public now, and I think translating that to political action is the challenge. But what is happening on the ground level, I think, should give us hope.
Before you go, on that note, when you're writing or when you're talking, I'm betting that your audience is engaged in what you're saying, and I bet that they really care about it. Are you learning to connect with people who aren't, or people who don't? And do you have ideas about how you want to try?
I think one of the challenges I'm facing out, on the book tour is you'll get those sympathetic readers, and they'll say, "I read this book, and I'm with you, but my uncle, my uncle would hate this," or or it's this political party, oh my God, or I'm just so hopeless. There's like a lot of like chic nihilism, like pessimism's cool now, And I think that overcoming that is a challenge, moving past that and getting folks into action is a challenge. I think I'm trying to do everything I can to talk to audiences outside of the tin. This is something that I'm obsessed with, so I'll go anywhere with folks that disagree with me, that don't share my views, and try to access that in any way I can.
Well, you'll go to lots of tables, but I'm glad you're at this one. Matthew Desmon, thank you so much for being here.
No, thanks for this conversation.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too.
Watch the Business Week Show, Thursday nights, 10:30 Eastern on Bloomberg Television, or 8:30.
You all get to share your thoughts. Kathy, are we recording this? Yes? Okay. So somebody asked me that earlier, and I thought we probably were. Okay. Really 3 basic questions, and you can respond to any one of them, but we'll start with what really jumped out at you from the book. Things you didn't know before, and I think it's important to ask, why do you think you never knew these things before? Because that's part of the fabric of the world we live in, is what information do we get, and what do we get taught, and what do we get told? And then hopefully we'll have some ideas for actions to take. So are you getting the other mic? Okay. So Why don't you go that way, I'll go this way, and raise your hand if you want to get the discussion started.
So why we, maybe we didn't know this before is because, I always think I'm going to spend the time to see what's going on in Congress and see what programs are going on, and I don't ever get to it, and it's not talked about, regularly, unless something catastrophic happens, and then maybe it'll come up in the news, but yeah, I think that's part of it, is that I don't take the time to see what's going on. So that definitely opened my eyes to all the programs that, came about and then went away. And I haven't even got a third way through the book. So I'm, yeah, some of those questions, might be answered later. But yeah, I just think that's something that needs to be talked about more.
Yeah, I can remember in the 90s, the first time someone actually drilled it into my head that most poor people have jobs. Yeah, that's a fundamental reality that a lot of Americans don't get. They think poor people are wandering around with their hands out. No, most poor people have jobs. Sometimes 2 jobs, sometimes 3 jobs. Sometimes they work 24 hours a day and take drugs to stay awake. I mean, it's crazy.
I don't know that anything really surprised me about it. I kind of, as a young adult, after I left home, experienced it for a number of years and wouldn't have got through it without parents dropping secret boxes of groceries on our porch. But also spending a career in social work, I found the book just irritated me, not because it wasn't the right information, but because that it took so long to get a book with the right information out there that people can really read about the truth of what our society does and believes about poor folk. And it gets me frustrated just reading the book. I haven't finished either, about halfway through, but I identified greatly with what he had to say and how he put it out there for those of us who might not know, even me, not know everything I think I do, but that it's ugly and we need to find a way to take action.
So I definitely have that, because of our background, I knew a lot of, hey, here are the limitations of these programs. That we introduce a program and then over time, the book talks about it, that we add stipulations and these requirements, and it talks about the work that, it takes to maintain access to the things that you can get. But what I'm taking away from it is to make sure that when we're talking about, hey, I'm pro these programs, or I want more access to the poor, that I try not to stipulate this is for somebody who is worthy. Because every time we try to make it where these resources only get to the ideal person in our head, we make it where the ideal person can't access those things. So the takeaway I've got from it is not only to be as equally loud, if not louder, about pro helping those that need these resources, but that I don't participate in some discussion about this is the ideal person who's very, very sympathetic, because those exist, but to also engage in, I'm okay if a drug addict gets access to food if it means that all kids get access to food. We need to make sure that, we try to be access to all over access to the perfect. And that the way I communicate it, I think, means that we allow for changes to these programs over time to protect from the evil, and we're making it harder for those that we want to protect. And we spend a lot of money on that. So, can we make it cheaper by making the process simpler.
Yeah, so there's definitely, I think, a stream in the resistance to having programs that help people that, yeah, I know some people need this kind of help, but some other unworthy people will get this help, so therefore I'm against having the program because, you know, somebody who doesn't deserve it, or someone whose skin is not white, will benefit from this program.
So I'm kind of somebody who exists on the lower end of this spectrum. I work for the government in California, and I'm a pretty lowly employee. I work seasonally. So when the end of my work season comes around, we go on unemployment. And even currently while I work, I spend about half of my paycheck on rent and, you know, utilities and things like that. And then when I go on unemployment, I get about half that money. So for those 3 months, I have to live off of just a couple $100s a month. And if you get unemployment, you can't get food stamps because you make too much money for their program to get, you know, multiple kinds of aid, right? So, you know, and then I look at someone like my father who makes, you know, has a six-figure income, and he complains about how the government takes too much taxes from him, you know? So there's a great dichotomy between, you know, what, you know, is made available for those who need it and then what people are willing to give, right? So, you know, it's kind of something where, you know, the perspective change is much more visual and felt on that lower end of the spectrum. But, you know, when you have a job that pays you well and you're able to live your life the way you want, you're not thinking about those kinds of things. It's like you have an abundance mindset to your life instead of, you know, living in a state where you have to think about these things constantly. So I just wanted to put that out there.
One interesting thing I got out of the book was he was talking about how people who need assistance struggle to get that assistance. The one example he said was about a third of the people in California who qualify for food stamps don't apply, whereas in Oregon, almost everybody who qualifies does apply. And he was talking about just the process of getting out the information. And there was one example, and I don't remember where it was, where they reduced the amount of information in the process and changed the font to make it easier to read and stuff. And then the amount of applicants then rose.
I'd like to dovetail on what you're saying, because on page 88, he talks about welfare avoidance. And not until page 123 did he finally explain exactly how Oregon had made it so simple that everybody uses debit cards and things, or the cards that you can use in the grocery stores, where in California, like say 1/3 weren't, because it was still too complicated to access it. So I thought that was the most important piece of the whole book for me, is welfare avoidance, and what was it and how could we solve it?
Because people who are working 2 or 3 jobs also just don't have a lot of spare time to like sit on hold with government offices and things like that. I think I learned something about funding of programs, and when you listen to the news about different programs and how much Congress is going to fund them and whatever, is that there's 2 different things in a benefits program. There's what are the qualifications to get it, and how much money has the government allocated to pay for that program. You know, what we're used to, the one that, you know, we're all familiar with, like Social Security, is an entitlement program. It's called that because the qualifications are the funding. If you qualify for Social Security, you will get it. And that, of course, has its own set of problems in that now the government has to come up with the money. But on other programs, the government doesn't have to come up with the money. They set, for like housing vouchers, there's a qualification level, so you can go through the application process and be qualified for a housing voucher. But the amount of money that's allocated, in the current fiscal year may cover, 30% of the people who are qualified. So it's two hoops. You have to qualify, and then you have to get lucky. It's not like if you qualify, you get the benefit.
This is probably a premature question, but my question is, what then is the role of the church?
You don't have an answer? Oh, okay.
I think some, and our church does a lot of things, but some of the churches who have really good food pantries and don't have a lot of barriers, some churches, well, we also work closely with the Methodist Church in building the homeless pods. So I think it's just continuing to find where the greatest need is and doing as much as we can. And if we do it as a community, not just our church, but as an entire community, it will help. It's not going to solve the problem, but it could help some who aren't eligible or able to get the other services.
Yeah, helping people who need help and solving the problem are two different things. Yeah, I'm glad you put it that way.
Last night I was watching a documentary just about the Cold War, and in some churches in East Germany, when there was still the wall, they kind of had to take into the decision into mind, how can we politicize, and all those kinds of things. And the head, priest said, the Lord gave us tools, right? We don't want to just shun them away, we want to be able to use them. So they use those tools to print leaflets and, have them use their phones and things like that. So I think that, without ever getting overly politicized about things, there are still lots of different avenues that, can be used to, provide these kinds of resources for people that maybe weren't there before.
That almost gets us back to Scott's sermon this morning about how living in resistance to empire by living in community, helping each other out, and lessen the power that the empire has over you, because you're not acting like the empire's boot is on your back of your neck.
I just want to add that I think that education, like what we're doing here, is very valuable to get different perspectives out, to help more people learn about what Matthew has shared about, misbeliefs about the poor, the idea that the income inequality is as great as it is, and then we can, as a congregation, can help spread that information even more widely. But I think just being a source of information and changing people's minds is very helpful.
Yeah, I do think I've had a couple of conversations since reading this book where somebody started to say, well, yeah, we could do that, but here's why it wouldn't work. And I was able to kind of push back on that a little bit and say, well, no, that's not really what's happening.
work I do this whole time. It makes me think back to probably 4 or 5 years ago when I was on the board for the foundation, and we did an event here and invited community agencies that need to get their stuff out there. A couple food programs came. I think Children's Services came. The thing we didn't do, now they were very glad to have our small group here and what people came, but if we could do that even on, not a huge scale, but invite the people who need those services and have like not a welfare fair, but I mean, have the programs that can offer things and invite people or get out the word to places that have people who could benefit, might be something we could do that is, you know, not more than I mean, it's work, obviously, but it's not a permanent thing. It's not an ongoing thing. It's not a long-term commitment, but it might get services out there to some people.
I also was on the grant committee for our foundation, and there are churches, Kathy, that do exactly that, have big fairs. I think it's called Sunrise Church out in Hillsborough. They have a huge fair once or twice a year where there's all kinds of things that help people in need. And lots of organizations come together, and it's a big weekend-long helping time. And they do a great job, that Sunrise Church.
One thing to keep in the back of your mind while we're talking about this is we now have some empty space in our building. Just throwing that out there.
I want to piggyback a little bit on what Kathy said about education. I think we can do a lot more with education, not so much about the programs that are currently available and how to apply for them and the sort of the ground level work, but some of how to change it systemically. We can advocate on issues bases, even if we can't advocate for specific political candidates or parties without risking our tax exempt status as a church. So choose whatever issue it is we want, particular program, whether it's the requirement to work in order to qualify for X program, you have to work or be in education X number of hours a week. I think that's usually work, and that prevents people from doing the things they need to do to improve their skills to get a better paying job, those kinds of things, or the amount of money that's spent on administering a program rather than actually funding the benefits, and how can you reduce the administrative burden and therefore have a much greater percentage of the tax dollars that people don't want to spend go to what they want it to go for.
Good points, all.
I'm kind of remembering our 20 plus year struggle with more light issues. That this
With what issues?
the more light issues, LGBT, you know, the alphabet soup. And we worked on that for, you know, educating ourselves and working on it little by little for like 20 years to get the Book of Order changed. That marriage was between two people rather than between a man and a woman. And, you know, we kind of got that Book of Order thing done. I wonder what we might choose to take on next long term. It's just an idea, but it would be sustained will and planning, but maybe this could be our next one.
Yeah, one area of legislation that's happened over the last decade or so that we may or may not have paid close attention to is changes in zoning laws. are a really critical piece of trying to get a housing system that works for more people. And Oregon's been a real leader in some of that. And I think we could do more to educate ourselves on that, because I don't feel like I've really followed it really well, but I've read a number of places that say, how housing is at the core of poverty and wealth gaps in this country.
I worked with the Somali Bantu community here for a few years, and I spent many hours driving them and sitting in offices like welfare, housing. I took them to food banks and all kinds of places. But one thing that was kind of frustrating for me is initially they lived in subsidized apartments, and after about 5 years they qualified for Section 8, or the waiting list. They rose to the top of the waiting list. And but houses and apartments here have occupancy limits. So these families with 10 kids theoretically had to have an apartment or house with 5 bedrooms, and there aren't any. So why can't more people live in apartments and houses? It's I ran up against that a lot, and eventually these people had to move. The people I was working with moved back to Erie, Pennsylvania, where they originally settled, and the rental market is much different there, because the homes that people are available for rent are like 100 years old, and they sell for less than $100,000, whereas rental properties here, this was a few years ago, were like $350,000 or $400,000. So they had no trouble getting housing because there weren't strict rules about who they could rent to in Erie.
Putting us back to question 2 a bit, in the tape that we watched, the recording, Matthew Desmon made a reference to the propaganda of capitalism, or I think that was his phrase, or something like that. That some of the things our economic system teaches us about how the world works, that also kind of keeps us in line, and so anybody have any great thoughts about how that propaganda of capitalism works and how it seeps into our education systems and our public discourse?
So don't get me started on this topic. First of all, my background is I grew up in poverty, in real abject poverty, in and out. My father had jobs, so I know deeply the experience of living in poverty. And now I'm squarely in the middle class, and it is very difficult once you're in the middle class to even remember what it was like backwards. Even now, I catch myself blaming people for not working hard enough. And I deeply know that everybody in my family, nobody went to high school, went to college, or became successful as myself. Each of them worked hard. What made the difference was that I was lucky. And I know we live in a capitalistic system, and I can sound Marxist sometimes, but certainly capitalism teaches us to think about those who deserve and those who do not. And, you know, in my experience in politics, you know, this isn't the first book. Robert Putnam was a writer of many books and consultant of many presidents on the issue of poverty and inequality, and nothing has changed. Remember Jonathan Edwards? His number one issue was poverty. And what happened? He got voted out for an affair or something else, but no president has ever, no person attempting to go far in politics has ever won with the first issue of poverty as their number one issue. And I believe it's because it's inherently a part of the American mindset that we must deserve everything. And if we succeed, it's because of our hard work. And maybe some people helped us on the way, that's great. But we blame people who have not. And yes, I think it's important that churches and everybody do programs. You know, I'm a social worker, and I know I teach at community college where students are largely in families of poverty. So I experience it every day. What my calling is to help give those students a leg up. And as a community college system, we are finally developing bachelor programs. Clark College, we have 7 bachelor programs now. And what those do is they give students the opportunity to get a 4-year degree at a community college cost. And so we need to think differently because our political will in this country will never change as long as capitalism is our driving motto. So there you have it.
Amen.
When Don talks about hard work, back in 1975, I took a business class, and the instructor made 2 points that we should remember when we're talking about money and business. One is the Protestant work ethic. And when Don talks about hard work, if we work hard, we are going to benefit. And if we work hard and we have those benefits, if we're the 1%, we protect that religiously. The other side of that, he stressed, was the corporate work ethic, Christian corporate work ethic, which is we may have the same amount of money that has come our way, but we share it with others in a Christian way, in a way that benefits more than just ourselves. So it's a Protestant work ethic and the Christian corporate ethic. So as I read this book, those are the filters that I look at this book through.
Yeah, I struggle to define what the difference between good capitalism and bad capitalism, because we're always going to have a capitalistic system, but there's definitely predatory capitalism, and there's common good sort of capitalism, and I struggle to define the difference, but to me it's a lot of it is, yeah, I can go out and make a lot of money, and that's okay in the American system, but who am I hurting when I do that? And I think if you go back to the time of the founders and of this country, they would want a capitalistic system where somebody with an initiative invents a product, they can go make it, they can make some money doing that. But the kind of capitalism that says, oh, I just bought a drug company and I see this drug that lots of people need, and my company's the only one that makes it, so I can jack the price way up, even though the only thing that does is make me more money at the expense of sick people. I mean, there's all kinds of examples.
I guess along the same line as the last couple of speakers here, I read Matthew's quote from Tolstoy after Tolstoy had made it financially, moved to Moscow, and was just awestruck by all the poverty. And his comment about putting your foot on the neck of the poor people really kind of struck me and made me think personally, what can I do or what do I do that encourages that or perpetuates that? Do I need the latest fancy car because I can afford it? Do I need to do this or that because I can afford it? Or should I be thinking more of others and helping pass the money to where it can be used more?
Well, I follow some sites, right-wing sites, just so I can try to understand what they believe. And one thing they deeply believe is that when you try to interfere in capitalism, you make things worse, you mess it up, like rent controls or something. Rent controls are just going to, make landlords stop renting, so there'll be no housing. Just anything you do to try to, any regulations or anything you try to do with interfering with the way the system works naturally is going to mess it up.
And sometimes they're right.
I just wanted to add that, the discussion we had last week or week before about the color of law, which we have a slide showing that book again, I think if we look back to our past, and not even our distant past, but like the 1950s, the 1930s, 40s, 50s, there was much different tax rates than there are now. We had an emphasis on the commons and on building infrastructure and various things that helped a lot of people. An idea of building the whole society up together. And that was part of the American way and part of what the American electorate supported. And both Democrats and Republicans supported that philosophy of support for the commons. And when racism sort of got involved in that in the 60s, then there was this new ethic that we don't want to support the commons because if we build a public swimming pool, black people might use it, and we don't want to promote that. So there has been a change over time, and even in many of our own lifetimes, we've seen a change. So I think that as a society, a goal might be to look towards revisiting the idea of the commons and about advocating for that. And I really liked what Kirsten said as a church, that no, we don't want to be, partisan politically, but there are things that we can advocate for that are policies and belief systems that are not a partisan political cause. So I think, that's something I'd really like to look at. Anyway, I just thought I'd say that.
One more comment.
The other thing that, listening to Dawn, and I remember a time in my first few years after I was married and we were out on our own, we were both working full-time jobs, and we couldn't afford our rent, and we went to this special help budget, figure out your bills, we'll make it right for you. And we went up, you take all this paperwork, they go through it all, you sit through a group meeting, got home the next day, and the guy called, well, I'm really sorry, but you're doing everything you can, you don't make enough to pay your bills. So that's with people working full-time and part-time hours and extra hours, and we still couldn't do it, and there's got to be something wrong with the society that makes it so that people who are doing everything they can and working should be able to make the minimum amount to live.
Yeah. Okay, one more here. A couple more questions, then we'll wrap this up.
If you travel to Switzerland, they have a wage system that everybody gets a living wage. And the belief is if I'm a hairdresser, I should be able to go down the street and pay for a hairdresser to do my hair also. So it's called living wage in Switzerland. It's just fascinating if you have a chance to go there or read about it, because it's so different than ours.
I haven't read the book, but I have worked with a lot of people who are in the poverty category as a public health nurse. And the one thing that I realized early on when I was working in newborn nursery and preemie nursery, that's the one time all people are equal. That's the only time they're really equal. They're treated exactly the same, everyone. And then from then on, they go out and they go into different kinds of living situations. It's never the same after that. And we somehow have to get to the place where in a democracy, people are free to earn $1 billion and enjoy it. Well, somehow we have to decide we're our brother's keeper, our sister's keeper, and change that.
I'm going to throw in one more thing. I've learned a lot in the last couple of years through some of these books we've read that the need to approach poor people as capable human beings who are capable of helping themselves if they have the opportunity, rather than as victims or helpless people. I mean, so it's what social workers call agency. Whenever you're looking at helping people, are you helping them in a way that keeps them dependent, or are you promoting their agency to go to be stronger in it? It helps me to remember that what's the number one mechanism in the biblical covenant system for helping poor people? Anybody know? It's gleaning, right? Everybody had their little family plot. They were supposed to work it 6 days a week. But if there was a stranger in town who had nothing to eat and they wandered through your fields and picked the stuff that you left, that was part of the system. That was part of how people were helped. That's not sitting waiting for a handout. That's an opportunity to pick their own food. They just didn't have the opportunity to grow it. So, you know, it's a perfect example of a program for helping those who have less by giving them an opportunity to help themselves, not just sit back and wait for a handout. Okay, I think we can wrap up unless someone has one more profound thing to say. Kathy, can we get the last slide with this book? Because I really wanted to give you all 2 books to read this summer, but that just was going to be too complicated. What I found in reading Poverty by America and also reading The Color of Law was I thought I got a much more complete picture. This book is about racial segregation in housing and how that's been a part of our system over the last, well, ever since slavery, ever since the Civil War. And all the pernicious effects that racial segregation and our housing policies contribute to the inequalities and the rate of poverty in the country. Now, I know Matthew Desmon touched on some of this in the book, but this is a complete book about racial segregation in housing that was very eye-opening to me, and I think most of the people in the book group found it the same. So for those who want extra reading, maybe a fall reading project, highly recommend this book. I have my copy here to loan out if somebody wants to take it home with them today. So thank you. Right. Yeah, I can't remember. There's a couple of them still out. That's one of the church copies, and I think, and you have one. And right, yeah, I read it as a Multnomah County Library checkout. So there's a lot of copies out there if you still have not read Poverty by America or this one. They're both widely available and highly recommended. So thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day.